guests because they have had illustrious careers. They are two remarkable women, two remarkable leaders, and they have dedicated themselves to the fight for dignity and equality of all people. I know their insights into this most delicate equilibrium that's necessary for tending to the plight of refugees while also ensuring the stability of our host countries will enable all of us to determine solutions to what is a growing issue as the world becomes less stable. And here to moderate that conversation, we also have Ali Aslan, who is, of course, a journalist. He's a friend of GMF. He's a Brussels Forum veteran and the moderator of this session. So, Ali, please, all come. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this kind introduction, and indeed, what a privilege to have these two ladies with us here for a very, very vital and timely topic. I don't have to tell you that the global refugee crisis has been dominating the news for a very, very long time. However, another topic that is dominating the headlines today at least, and that's why as a journalist I think you would all understand that I wouldn't want to pass up the opportunity of having Madam Secretary here with us, of asking her, of course, getting her reaction on the breaking news. We will tend to the refugee crisis extensively in just a moment, but of course, Madam Secretary, you were the highest level US official to visit North Korea while in office. That was in 2000. You met then with Kim Jong-il, and I understand back then people were talking about relations between those two countries moving in the right direction, the positive direction, because of your visit. Now we have the news that President Trump might meet with Kim Jong-un by May. Now, of course, I have to ask you, I have to get your reaction. What do you make of this?
Well, I think that this is obviously a very serious problem, that we've all been looking at what is going on in North Korea. And North Korea has been a problem for some time. I do teach, and I say foreign policy is just trying to get some country to do what you want. So what are the tools? And we don't have a lot of tools in the toolbox, and diplomacy is the basic tool. Economic sanctions are obviously a tool. I won't go through the whole toolbox, but I'm very glad that I have been advocating for a diplomatic contact. I think it's important. What I'm concerned about is the lack of preparation for it, because I can tell you before I went, first of all, we'd had an awful lot of talks with the North Koreans, some at the United Nations, and then the #2 guy, Vice Marshal Cho, came to the United States in order to invite President Clinton to go. And President Clinton wisely said, I'm not going until this is prepared. I'm sending the secretary. That didn't thrill them, but nevertheless. And then I went with a team. And before that, we'd actually had a whole review of what our policy was going to be towards North Korea. So what I'm concerned about is that what has been the preparation for this, and who is going with the president, where are they going? And then the part that's a little weird is that all this has been announced by the South Koreans. And so the question is, where's this going? But I prefer talking to actually some of the other options that have been talked about.
So in principle, you approve of the decision to talk. You're just concerned about the lack of preparation.
Absolutely, because it's very detailed and complicated subjects. And you do need a team. I had a team that went with me. And when we were leaving, we were in the middle of talks in terms of dealing with missile limits.
Thank you so much. Getting the elephant, addressing the elephant in the room, if you will. Thank you so much for addressing this issue. So we lay this to rest now. All journalists in the room can breathe, relief and go back to their wires and print this. Because refugees is indeed the topic. The refugee crisis, refugees in crisis, as a matter of fact. That's what the session is titled. Now, Madam Secretary, your family, of course, your family emigrated to the United States in 1948 from what was then Czechoslovakia. You yourself, your family, you were refugees, if you will. If you come across these headlines about Syrian refugees, about the refugees from the Sahel region, Yemen, and so on and so forth, what does it stir in you? Are the memories from your own experience are so vivid that the refugee crisis as we see it today, can you still relate to it on a personal level?
Yeah. Well, I actually was a refugee twice, because during World War II, we spent the war in England, and we were refugees, and were welcomed and treated with respect. And my father worked for the Czechoslovak government in exile. When we came to the United States, I don't have a terrible story of escaping in a boat or something. We actually came on diplomatic passports, but then my father didn't want to work for the communists, so he defected and asked for political asylum. And I still have the letter, or I was given the letter in which he wrote begging for asylum. And what he said always was, what an incredible country, that people would say to us, we're so sorry your country's been taken over by a terrible system. You're welcome here. What can we do to help you? And when will you become a citizen? And that's what my father said made the difference, that America was ready to welcome people. All I wanted, I really describe myself as a grateful American, but the issue is, how do you fit in? How are you welcomed? Are you treated with dignity? Are you given a chance to work? Because are you given a chance to blend in? It's not easy blending in if you come from a mother who cooks Czech food all the time, but, and a father who fished in a coat and tie. But nevertheless, I fit in, and the story came out pretty well.
Indeed, indeed. I would say so. I would say so indeed. And thank you for sharing that personal story.
I'm going to tell one other time. One of the things I love to do is to give out naturalization certificates. And I did it the first time on July 4th, 2000 at Thomas Jefferson's home. And I'm handing a certificate, and this man goes off and he says, "Can you believe it? I'm a refugee, and I was given my certificate by the Secretary of State." And I went up to him and I said, "Can you believe that a refugee is Secretary of State?"
Yeah.
It's a very moving story.
Yeah.
Very touching, moving story indeed. And Kristalina Georgieva, you, of course, are the CEO at the World Bank, but many of you also know here as the former EU Commissioner for International Cooperation, Humanitarian Aid and Crisis Response. So you know a thing or two about this issue that we're dealing with and talking about here today. Now, the World Bank traditionally stays out of humanitarian issues, if you will. It's not its prime focus, its daily meat, if you will. But it has gotten more engaged as of late, hasn't it?
Very much so. Before I get to answer your question, actually listening to Secretary Albright, who, by the way, is adored by all Slavic women and beyond.
There's a Slavic woman.
A Slavic woman there. I was actually listening to you and realizing that while I didn't come to the US as a refugee, I can think of myself as an economic migrant. I came to the US in search of opportunities. I was of the best kind, highly educated, and not knowing at all my market value. And I didn't do so badly either. So the question is why? Because we do have an environment in which people can reach their full potential. And how is it that we can retain and, if possible, expand this environment for more people? When I was Commissioner for Humanitarian Aid, I had a front row seat in the most dramatic crisis. And of course, the Syrian crisis is one of them. Today, the Syrian crisis doesn't make it as number one, doesn't make it as number two, doesn't make it as number three. On the ranking of crises by the crisis group is number 6. And yet, the country is still in ruins. The Syrian people who used to be in a middle-income country are now around 60% of them living in poverty, many of them in neighboring countries. And that is why we cannot, in the development world, ignore the refugee problem. First, unfortunately, it is growing. Growing in numbers. We now have almost 25 million refugees. growing in longevity. People stay refugees year after year after year after year. And with conflicts not retrieving and climate change expanding, these numbers are going to go up. For a development organization like the World Bank, this means three things. One, recognize that we have an incredibly important moral and development objective to work to prevent crisis from happening, to address the root causes, to invest in development in the most difficult and fragile environments. We have increased our fund for poor countries by 50%. This is called IDA, International Development Association money, from $50 to $75 billion. But we have increased funding for fragile countries that are most likely to be the source of refugees by 100%, from $7 to $14 billion. And we invest consciously and systematically into preventing displacement. Secondly, we learned that to help refugees, first and foremost, we have to help the countries and the communities that host them. If we don't do that, if we zero only on the refugees, there would be a clash, inevitably. So we now build programs in countries like Jordan, Lebanon, that are treating both the refugees and the local populations we are helping across. We follow the people in need, not the label of the country. So it may be richer country, but with lots of poor refugees, we provide concessional financing. And the third and very important thing we do is to help the world understand the responsibility to do more for countries and people in crisis, because it is morally right, but also because it is in each of us here in this room in our own interest. Crises don't stay in one place. Problems travel. And as the Europeans found out, the refugee crisis was like a slow-moving tsunami. It did come and it did hit us.
And hit it.
Oh, yes.
In 2015 in Europe, most particularly, which is why, if we look at the state of Europe, 2015, as you said, correct, Georgieva, it did hit us. Now we are at a juncture where the European Union is grappling with how to deal with the situation, how to distribute the refugees. And it's no coincidence, or rather no secret, that there are some countries, such as Poland or Hungary, who are on principle refusing to take in any. What do you make of this, Madam Secretary?
Well, I'm horrified, frankly, especially Hungary, where people prepared a lot to help them in 1956 and were welcoming to refugees. I do think that the issue is one that is complex because decisions are made in Brussels and then other countries are supposed to fill it out. But I think I have to say it this way. The United States is not doing its job. And for a country that has a lot of space, and refugees have actually done pretty well. The bottom line is we keep cutting our numbers where we're not taking people and, in fact, behaving in an un-American way. And I think it is very hard for the United States to tell a European country to take more if we are not doing enough. Or what you were talking about, Jordan. We cannot, this is a ridiculous, it's as though people have forgotten what it says on the Statue of Liberty. And so I am very troubled by our policy, and so I'm not going to criticize the Europeans because we're not doing our share.
Harsh and unambiguous words, as we are used to it from Madam Secretary. Well, as an American, she doesn't want to criticize the Europeans, Ms. Georgieva. Would you like to take on that job?
Let me look around and see my friend Europeans. Look, we Europeans, because I'm one of us, Actually, we are good people, and I think we are a little harder on ourselves.
Why are people laughing at that? This is...
They're not the Europeans that are laughing, right?
There you go.
No, here we go. No, what I mean to say here is that, yes, we need to look at the mirror and see that we could and must do better. But there are two things that have happened since this crisis hit. The first one is that actually Europe recognized that it has a very significant responsibility for countries in the Middle East, in North Africa, in the Sahel, in the Horn of Africa. And funding for Europe actually has increased by 15%. At the time when many countries are becoming a bit stingier, Europe is stepping forward. And the second thing Europe is doing is to be much more proactive, to use more creative instruments to help host countries and host communities. For example, in Jordan, Europe struck a deal, a compact with Jordan, in which Jordan gives jobs to refugees in Jordanian enterprises, and Europe buys the goods produced with a more liberal trade regime. Now, this being said, Europe being a highly sophisticated regulatory production machine, has made it so difficult for companies to actually export that the Jordanians came to us at the bank and said, please, can you help us to deal with this proposition? Right. But there is something going on. I would say to each and every European, it is in your interest to embrace this issue. Because guess what?
But what do you do with the countries who obviously don't agree with you on that? They're saying, no, it's not in our interest. It's against our interest to take in refugees.
Say it again and again and again. But also be more sensible around jobs we give to different countries. What we ask them to do. I would strongly advocate that in this division of labor, maybe the Eastern Europeans are better suited to protect the external borders of Europe because, as we know, Eastern Europe in the old days had such a good border control that a bird couldn't fly over.
Yeah.
We are good at that, and it is also necessary. It is necessary, and get the Western countries to be more on the issue of integration of refugees, and then make sure that we collectively embrace this as a common mission. And I'm saying this to my friends in Bulgaria. I was actually quite shocked when Bulgaria initially was quite negative on refugees, but then I understood one thing, that the refugee crisis didn't come on its own. It came together with also a terrorism threat. It came together with populism for other reasons, not just because of the refugees. So we have to be realistic around the very simple fact, Madam Secretary, we are not very good in dealing with multiple crises at the same time. And crises are not polite. They don't say, okay, refugee crisis, my turn, terrorism, you wait. Right. And I think we have to be, when we dissect these issues, we have to bring as much realism and objectivity and make sure that we can bring people on board, right, rather than push them aside.
And indeed, there certainly is no shortage of crises these days. Many at the same time. You mentioned it, Yemen, Syria, in the Sahel region, Libya, the list goes on. And which begs the question, we're talking about the refugee crisis. Is this still a crisis, or is that the new norm?
Well, I think we either talk about emergency or crisis, which you think can be dealt with and go away. Mm-hmm. I think this is a long-term issue that requires the governments to look at it exactly as you've been saying, in terms of a longer-term issue. And you may be surprised by what I'm about to say, but I did a study on the Middle East with Steve Hadley recently. And in that part, we talked about the fact that refugees could be seen as an asset, The people that leave their countries are brave and entrepreneurial, that they want to make a new life, and to see them in some way as a positive thing rather than a burden. But I do think it's a long-term issue which requires dealing with it, first of all, as you pointed out, to look at what has created them, but then also figure out the funding. And this is what hasn't been really working, the UN system and money for the refugees, and then the displacement. And one thing we're not talking about, when you say 22 million, I mean, basically there's 65 million people, but most of those people are what are called displaced people within their own countries that are also creating a number of ripples that make it difficult to absorb.
Indeed. And Ms. Georgieva, there's no way around it. Almost every, if not all, European elections as of late have had the issue of refugees as a prime issue. You can argue the Brits, the British people, voted on behalf of Brexit because of their fear, if you will, of migrants, refugees. The Italians, once again, as of late, the Germans back in September. This issue is clearly poisoning the political atmosphere here in Europe. There's no way about this. Where's the fix here?
It is actually not only here in Europe. It is most visible in Europe because in Europe it was a big shock, 1.5 million people coming in a relatively short period of time. And that Europe was not prepared for, although we should have been. We should have seen that coming.
And if I may, this is a country, this is a continent of 500 million people. Countries like Turkey have taken in 3 million. Lebanon, Jordan. These countries have taken in over their head refugees. This is a continent, rich continent, affluent continent of 500 million people. We cannot absorb 1.5 million refugees?
You know, when I was humanitarian commissioner, I actually would go around and beg countries to understand what it is to be a refugee. That we are talking about people who don't live because they are capriciously taking a luxurious boat. They live because their kids would be killed or would die from hunger. And I'm a mother. If my child is to be in this situation, I do everything to save her life. And it was very actually worrying to see how it is difficult for people to absorb this message, because we have to realize there is so much that comes with fake news and fear. Fear grows long legs very, very quickly. And that fear that they're here to kill us, to rape our girls and women, it has been amplified so massively. My conclusion, and I have been talking about it a lot, is that anger, fear, hate, they're very loud. Goodness, very quiet. And yet in Europe we have so much goodness. I was with a German a colleague a couple of days ago. He adopted a kid from Guinea and took 2 children from Syria, helping now their families to come. Our problem in Europe is that these are not the stories that make headlines. So how we can amplify this voice of goodness that is actually predominant, but you don't hear it, you don't see it. This is something that, okay, now I'm going to turn on the moderator. You, media, you have to help us with. You have to find this silver bullet.
Yeah, I'm spreading the bad news.
To get that to be the dominant, because it is actually what makes people do even more of it.
Right.
And I am anybody who has ever been in humanitarian action knows that to be a humanitarian, you have to be an optimist. You cannot do this job otherwise. And this is why I'm an optimist. I actually think that once we now recognize the longevity of this, it is not anymore a crisis, it is new normal. We are working through solutions, and I'm proud to be part of the solutions at the World Bank.
Absolutely. You are, and let's make sure that the voices of positivity that you're calling for are heard loud and clear. We're clearly making sure they are heard here at the Brussels Forum and on stage, Madam Secretary. Now, we've diagnosed the problem, if you will. Everybody knows the root causes that you have alluded to. What are the next steps, Madam Secretary? If you were still in charge, what is the advice, for instance, that you would give to a U.S. president?
Well, I think the advice I would give is to make sure that the system is the kind. Every country has a right to make up its immigration policy. That is a sovereign right. But trying to figure out how to have an organized process to have people that want to come to the country, need to come to the country, and are willing to be a part of it, and then have a process that is not demeaning, that automatically starts asking if somebody's a terrorist, or if you're a Muslim, or making it really awful at the beginning. I also do think that, again, and this goes back to our government has to be better organized on it. I have just been reading that there's some new person that is now in charge of population at the State Department who is opposed to immigration. So I think that is not actually useful. And so I think that, so what I keep doing is, it's a little self-serving, is to say immigrants want to come to America. Refugees, we wanted to be helpful and really care. One of the things, if I might, just a statistic on Jordan, which is a frontline state. A few years ago, I was talking to King Abdullah, and he was saying, you know, it's as though the United States had 40 million refugees. We are now several thousand. And so I saw him a couple of years later, and I used the same statistic, and he said, no, you're wrong. It's as though you had 60 million refugees. And these are people that are living in Jordan, not all in camps, but are part of their economy. And so I think we have to show that it is a good thing. If I might make another point in a larger issue, I think that we've had discussions here about what globalization means and what are the good aspects and what are the problems. There's a downside to globalization, which is that it's faceless. And what is happening is people are searching for their identities. And especially in Europe, and this is the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I, many of the countries, all the countries in Central and Eastern Europe were founded on the basis of national identity. So when there are economic problems and there are people who come that are not that nationality, then you always look for a scapegoat. And so then the fear factor and all that comes up. And so we have to be careful about this national identity aspect. We all want to know who we are, but not if my identity hates your identity. And that's what I think we have to be careful about.
Yep.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's such a pleasure and an honor to listen to the both of you speak about this issue so eloquently and diplomatically, if I may say, Madam Secretary. But of course, this is the time where we should get in some voices. We have time for 2-3 questions. It's a relatively brief session. I've seen that Miki Zerenda, former Prime Minister of Slovakia, you raised your hand. Let's get him a microphone here, please. And I would truly ask you, keeping in mind this is a relatively short session, to keep your remarks brief.
Thank you. Dear Kristalina, not only many Slavic ladies recognize Madam Secretary of State, but also some of the Slavic men. With the best memories, Madam Secretary of State, on our former collaboration, I would like to ask you, it means international community, but also particular states affected by migration. We all are mostly dealing with consequences of immigration. But some people argue, having in mind that there is something like absorption capacity of Europe on one side and huge potential of migration in the future, especially when it comes to Africa. These people argue that we should pay higher attention on prevention to address the root causes of immigration. Realizing huge complexity of the issue, I would like to ask you, how do you take such argument, or what should be done by the US by the EU in this regard?
I think you point up a very difficult part of this, and this is why I said this was a long-term problem. We do have organizations, both international and national, where we should be helping countries deal with their development issues, and I personally believe their democracy issues, to try to create places where I think most people don't want to leave the home where they were born, where they speak the language and they have their family. The thing that I'm worried about is climate change, for instance. A lot of the people that are leaving Africa are doing so because they've been pushed out of their countries because of desertification, which means we have to recognize that the Earth is not flat, and that there is such a scientific basis to climate change, which is the longer-term thing. So I think we need to have short, medium, and long-term action plans, because this is the new normal, and we have to figure out how to be helpful to countries in terms of their development issues and their political issues.
All right, let's take in 2, 3 more. Please go ahead.
Hello, my name is Nancy Lindborg from U.S. Institute of Peace. Thank you both. Two questions. Kristalina, the bank is just concluded its Fragility Forum, which is exactly an effort to try to get at the roots of the problem. Can you say more about how your new investment, your new allocation of funds for fragile states is making a difference in especially tackling some of the core sort of political governance issues when you are a member state institution, how that's working? And then how should we be distinguishing, and how do we in these national discourses, the difference between migration and refugee flows? Because I think certainly in the United States, that's become very conflated and very confused for people.
All right, thank you so much. Please go ahead. Ms. Georgieva,
Okay.
why don't you take the first one?
There are two very significant shifts that have happened over the last years in terms of how the World Bank works in fragile contexts. The first one is that we are much closer and integrated with the humanitarian organizations like the UN humanitarian organizations, UNICEF, UNHCR, WHO, or ICRC, the Red Cross movement, and the Red Cross movement. Why? Because in fragile environments, these organizations have higher tolerance for insecurity. They have integrated themselves in the local communities much better than the World Bank can ever do. We also work much more closely with the security community, and we think of ways in which we can build on each other's strengths. So our interventions would be, for the short term, life-saving, but they also would build a better chance for resilience. I'm thinking of what you said, Madam Secretary, about desertification. When a drought hits Somalia, we can ship life-saving food supplies, or we can do a bit of that and help the Somali communities to have better wells, better livestock, better seeds, better resilience to the next drought, so it is less painful. So we work in that new way, and for those who work on development or humanitarian action, this is revolutionary. Sounds like total common sense, but the most common thing about common sense, not very common. We have been not doing it for years. We would be two worlds, a world apart. The second big change in how we work on fragility is that we are much more seriously investing in creating private sector opportunities and engagement, starting from microfinance for women in particular, but also for men, making sure that there could be local markets, and the local markets would inject energy in, by the way, for refugees and local communities. Sometimes refugees from South Sudan can be very vibrant. As Madam Secretary said, they can be contributors. So we think of private solutions to something that is going to be with us for a very, very long time.
Right. Thank you.
Well,
I think,
Nancy, to answer your question, I think refugees are people who escape or because they are afraid for their lives, persecution, killing, any number of rape, etc. Immigrants are people theoretically who want to just improve their life. I find the distinction difficult because, especially since it's harder to decide what is real threat if you can't eat or can't make a living. The reason that it's done the way it is, it's by international agreement. There are refugee covenants and a variety of treaties in order to be able to divide it. I do think that we as a country need to focus also on the immigration, especially, for instance, coming out of Latin America. A lot of those are immigrants. Mexico is a perfect example. There are fewer people coming now because their economy has improved. NAFTA is actually a good thing. And partially, you don't have to build walls. What you need to do is to help people have a better life, and that deals with the immigration issue, not the refugee issue.
All right, thank you. I got the next, perhaps final 3 questions locked up. Please be short.
Steve Krasner, Stanford University. So it seems to me it's necessary to make a distinction between individuals and groups. In the United States, it's true now, there are many prominent African Americans, including someone who's been president. If you look at per capita income for African Americans in the United States, it hasn't increased 1 iota in the last 40 years. Madam Secretary, in your own case, I mean, your own family wiped out its religious heritage so completely that you were even unaware of it. So my question is this. Is there any country that either of you can point to which has done well with regard to both individuals and groups in terms of dealing with refugees or migration?
What?
I don't know the answer to that question.
When we look at the world, in the developing world, there are actually very surprising examples of genuinely welcoming countries that are very poor themselves. Yemen, before the war, they're still actually having Somali refugees, but before they got dragged into a horrible situation, they were on the receiving end of some 800,000 refugees, mostly from Somalia, and they would be welcoming them, allowing them to work. If their camps and conditions are good, they would be in the camps, but they would be everywhere. I'm thinking of Ethiopia. Ethiopia, in a similar way, is welcoming refugees. In the Western, in Europe, you also would see some nations doing much better in terms of creating conditions for integration. Sweden, among the Nordic countries, and I see somebody here from Sweden, has done, in relative terms, better. The borderline is where refugees are allowed to work and integrate in communities. Uganda, I would put also Uganda in that category of allowing land ownership, allowing people to work, and where they're not allowed to work. Why? Because knowing that they're going to be there for a long time, helping refugees to help themselves is the best thing we can do for them and for the communities. They are not a drag on the economy, they can be a contributor. But unfortunately, we also see very many not so good examples. And now we have a chance with the UN Compact on refugees to try to put real teeth on the compact, to put some markers for proper behavior, and then hold countries accountable for them.
All right, so some best case examples that you have cited there. Thank you for that. Now, I'm going to turn the mic to a gentleman who's also responsible for spreading bad news. It's Nick Gowan from the BBC. Nick, go ahead.
Do I have to defend myself?
Yes.
Good afternoon. I'm moved by what Kristalina said about it was a shock to Europe in 2015. And we've talked about this before. But I would say it wasn't a shock and shouldn't have been a shock because the UNHCR had been warning for 2 years The IOM had been warning for 2 years. No one was quite sure about the numbers, but the political motivation wasn't there to actually accept that the unthinkable was coming down the track. It wasn't unthinkable, it was unpalatable. No one wanted to look at it. People in the German government said to me, we were more concerned about saving the euro. The president of Croatia said, we dropped the ball, we didn't see it coming. And as a result, they were panicking. Therefore, I'm suggesting to you both that actually there's clear migration movement and intention, both migrants and also refugees, which many political leaders are not prepared to actually accept is the inevitable, leading therefore to the kind of political upset that we've seen now in many European countries and elsewhere. It's about leadership, about the unthinkables.
Madam Secretary, do you see a lack of leadership here?
I do, because I do think that it's kind of a sense where some of the European leaders are saying it's all Brussels' fault. Nobody really talked to us enough, which I think is not true. And there's not enough leadership. And I think that it's kind of a blindness to what is, unfortunately, the inevitable. I do think we need to work more on the solutions to the problems that are creating the refugees, which is certainly true in the Middle East, and seeing what the kind of rolling fear factor that began with the war in Iraq and then spread further north, and now there you've got it in Yemen. And so, but I think that it's a matter of planning, difficult because it is planning for the worst, and that is not ever a great encouragement for leaders, but I think leadership is what's essential here. And in the United States, I think, and I go back to something that I said, the United States is a country of immigrants. And I think that it is wrong that we are not taking a leadership role in welcoming people, because otherwise, as I said earlier, we can't tell other people what to do.
Mm-hmm. Clear words. You have something to add, Ms. Georgieva. Lack of leadership is the topic here.
Oh, yeah, well, when you again, I'm turning up my positive side. When there is leadership, very good things happen. Look at Canada. Canada has a minister for refugees who is a Somali refugee. They have taken a very different approach to open borders, bringing refugees. So I think we should highlight as much as we can the positive examples of leadership, and then try to get those examples to lift the bar for others to follow.
And hopefully
And yes, think of the unthinkable. This is, if I learned one lesson in my life as crisis commissioner, is think of the unthinkable and make sure the international community is together to help each other when the unthinkable happens.
And I think one additional thing on Canada, it's not just the government. It is very interesting in terms of the way they're working with their communities and the citizens of Canada that are welcoming the refugees.
Yeah. Last question, Bill Drozdiak.
Hi, Bill Drozdiak, McClarty Associates. If the West, the United States and Europe, adopted enlightened, open-door immigration policies, a number of leaders in the Middle East and Africa have warned this could have devastating consequences for them, in that it would reinforce a brain drain that would drive the doctors, the engineers out of their country. How would you deal with the policy dilemma of perhaps through a well-intentioned policy of attracting talented immigrants into the West, that we would perhaps be contributing to more failed states in the third world?
All right, thank you, Bill.
I'm not sure I'd use the word attracting in terms of a new policy. I think it's more a matter of accepting and realizing that they can be additions. But I do think that this then leads to the very serious issue of all of us and various people in the political realm trying to deal with political solutions in those countries so that people want to stay in the country where they were born. And what I think is interesting are the number of people that go back, even under bad conditions. So I do think it is a matter of political will and international cooperation to try to deal with what's going on in Syria, which is now, as you pointed out, the great problem, and so political solution on that regard. But attracting is different, I think, than being able to accommodate.
No, please.
Just very quickly, telegraphically. I am an example of brain drain, right? But we also create positive returns, because we bring experience back to the countries we come from. We open the eyes of people to how the world functions, and we send money home.
We have a couple of minutes remaining before we wrap up this very important session. But of course, I don't want to end the session without ending on a positive note. Ms. Georgieva, you've said the best case example, you've cited them already, many things. What gives you hope at the end of the day vis-a-vis the refugee crisis? What are the positive steps that you're seeing out there that tells you, in the words of Angela Merkel, wir schaffen das?
Well, the positive is that I think we are slowly sinking the fact that the world we live in is more fragile. It is richer, but it is more fragile. And we actually need each other. What is the guarantee that tomorrow's refugee is not going to be me? And I think building that concept of solidarity, recognizing that this is how it is going to be, and changing, including institutions like mine, to be leaders in providing solutions, that gives me hope.
Madam Secretary.
I do think that, for instance, there is an attempt at the United Nations now to have a new compact on this, that this has to be seen not as the problem of one country, either the creator or the solver of it, and that it comes through international cooperation. And I'm encouraged by the kind of actions that have been taking place. Lloyd Axworthy, the former Foreign Minister of Canada, actually is leading a group in terms of looking at what the responsibilities are, what is the accountability, and then the funding of it. And I think there have to be practical steps in order to see this as a long-term problem dealt with by the international community.
And what gives me hope is that Madam Secretary has the globe with a refugee angel on it.
Yeah.
It's interesting interpretation, but
it is. It's an angel sitting on top of the UN globe. So.
And you think your own country is going to come around?
I hope so, because I think that we are ruining our reputation, and that we need to, and a lot of us that have been refugees or might be afraid of being refugees are really pushing on this and trying to be helpful and saying it's a mistake to equate refugees and immigrants with crime. And that people want to make a part here, and that some of us that have, I think, need to lead the fight.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think I speak for all of you when I say this session could have gone on at least for another 45 minutes, and we probably still would not have dived into most issues. Suffice to say, this issue is slowly wrapping up, but it's been a true delight and honor to moderate this session with two incredible women, Madeleine Albright, Kristalina Georgieva. Wonderful to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.